A unique project is enhancing New Jersey's oyster reefs through the help of local restaurants. The Department of Environmental Protection program recycles seafood shells from restaurants and uses them to improve the quality of the oyster reefs.
An oyster restoration project, the oyster harvest season.
They start with leftover oyster shells from local restaurants.
Florida dumped over 500,000 tons of discarded oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico. And 18 months later, the seafloor was alive in ways no one had ever seen before. Marine biologists were expecting 3 to 5 years before anything measurable would happen. Instead, monitoring teams pulled up cores showing 847 oysters per cubic meter, in patches where the surrounding ocean floor held effectively zero.
They form baby oysters or spat, and then they just grow like gangbusters. I think that's amazing. So you just throw out shell and then all of a sudden you have an oyster reef.
One charter captain who had fought the program in state hearings stood on his boat over the new reefs and said the words he had sworn he would never say. He had been wrong, and what the scientists eventually figured out about why the seafloor responded so fast is stranger than the result itself. The dump nobody wanted. Between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission ran one of the most contested coastal experiments in the state's history. The plan, on paper, looked almost embarrassingly simple. Collect discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities across Florida, truck them to the coast, load them onto barges, tip them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key, more than 500,000 tons of them. The backlash was instant. Environmental groups called it disposal, dressed up as conservation, warning the shells would smother whatever life still clung to the soft, sandy seafloor below.
The benefits of putting oysters in the water are something we constantly have to explain. Even though we've seen some benefits, it's still something that regulators are very hesitant about because it can pose a health and human safety hazard if they're, poached or vandalized in any way.
Coastal fishermen, who had read these waters for generations, feared sediment disruption, collapsed habitats, and permanent damage to the grounds their families depended on. The opposition was organized, credible, and driven by genuine ecological concern from people who knew these waters intimately. The commission moved forward anyway. Their reasoning was blunt. Those shells were going to landfills regardless. If there was any meaningful chance they could function as substrate for a damaged reef system, running the experiment was worth the political cost. Nobody, not the program's architects, not the marine biologists reviewing the proposal, not the fisheries managers who signed off on it, actually expected things to move quickly. 18 months after the first shell drops, monitoring teams returned to the deposition sites, bracing for data that would confirm what the skeptics had been saying all along. What they found instead stopped Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, mid-sentence during a team debrief. Life is colonizing the shell mounds, not 2 years in, not 3 years in, which is the standard minimum timeline for any detectable biological response from an artificial reef project. In months, clusters of marine organisms are forming at rates that have no equivalent anywhere in the existing scientific literature.
Are you surprised at how fast it's taken?
Shocked. Shocked. We just had to protect the shoreline a little bit to give a chance for these grasses to gain a foothold. And with it, all this life, and that's been the biggest thrill for us. This isn't just grass and some reefs, and this thing is teeming with life.
The shells aren't behaving like passive debris on the seafloor. They are functioning as biological triggers, kickstarting processes. The surrounding environment has no mechanism to start on its own, and nobody could fully account for why it was happening so fast. To find that answer, you had to look at something so small it was essentially invisible to the naked eye. The invisible phase. The first colonizers weren't fish, they weren't oysters, they weren't anything you could see from a research vessel. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells settling onto the seafloor, microscopic bacterial communities were moving across the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms, structured living carpets that transform an inert shell into functional microhabitat. This wasn't a random scattering of microorganisms. It was organized biological infrastructure, laying a foundation that everything else would eventually build on. And it was happening on every shell, every fragment, every surface the barges had dumped overboard. Hundreds of thousands of tons of substrate, all activating in parallel. And the shells themselves were doing something nobody had fully anticipated. Oyster shells are composed primarily of aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate that dissolves slowly in seawater. As those shells released calcium ions, they generated tiny, localized alkaline zones, microscopic chemical environments embedded in the broader Gulf chemistry. Those shifts were exactly the chemical handshake that calcifying organisms, barnacles, tube worms, juvenile oysters require before they will commit to a surface. The shells weren't just providing physical structure, they were engineering the conditions for their own colonization. Weeks later, diatoms and microalgae moved into the established biofilms, laying down the base layer of a rudimentary food web. Microscopic crustaceans and larval mollusks followed, grazing on the algae. Those grazers drew in the first juvenile fish. Each biological stage fed directly into the next. A self-reinforcing cycle was building itself, invisibly, out of discarded seafood scraps on the dark floor of the Gulf.
You start to have fish that are building communities within the crevices, within the boxes of dead oysters. It starts to provide a whole habitat right off the bottom.
The timing is what genuinely unsettled the researchers. Coral reef recovery is measured in decades. Mangrove reforestation projects are measured in years. The standard scientific expectation for any meaningful biological response from a substrate intervention sits in the range of 3 to 5 years at the absolute fastest. The cedar key shell deposits compress that timeline by an order of magnitude, with no fertilization, no seeding, no chemical priming, no laboratory-cultured larvae released into the water, just discarded shells and time. Sandy seabeds cannot do this. Sand offers no attachment surface for biofilm formation, no chemical microzones, no structural complexity of any kind. Florida's soft-bottom Gulf floor had been biologically stuck in a kind of ecological dead end. The shells bypassed that dead end entirely. By the end of the first 6 months, the shell surfaces were coated in biofilm and microalgae. To anyone looking from above, or even diving the sites, they looked like failure. A pile of old shells sitting on a flat seafloor, slowly going gray. But Dr. Krimsky's water samples and sediment cores told a completely different story. In less time than most traditional artificial reef projects show any measurable biological response at all, the shell deposits had established a complete, functioning microscopic ecosystem. The scaffolding was already in place, and what came next made the scientists question everything they thought they understood about how reefs actually form. The return of the reef builders. Oysters require hard surfaces to survive. That single biological constraint had been quietly strangling Florida's Gulf Coast for decades, and most people never knew it was happening.
Where all of these oysters, and then we've even got some natural spat baby oysters growing on them. And we've got a bunch of mussels, some barnacles, and these are actually all alive.
Oyster larvae, called spat, drift through the current searching for substrate. In a healthy reef system, that substrate is the accumulated shell mass of previous generations. Centuries of dead oysters layered into a dense, complex platform that filters water, buffers erosion, and supports an estimated 300 distinct species. Florida's natural reef systems had been gutted. Overharvesting, pollution, coastal development, and the resulting runoff had progressively dismantled a reef network that once covered hundreds of square miles of Gulf floor. By the early 2000s, spat were drifting through open water with almost nowhere to land. No substrate, no settlement, no new oysters. The reproductive cycle had broken down completely. The Gulf had no internal mechanism left to repair itself. The dumped shells solved that bottleneck almost immediately. Each shell mound was a concentrated landing zone, positioned sometimes by design, sometimes by the logic of Gulf currents, exactly where drifting spat would travel. Within the first year, Dr. Bill Pine, a marine researcher at the University of Florida Marine Lab, documented juvenile oysters attaching to the deposited shells in numbers that significantly exceeded program projections. The larvae were finding surface. They were settling. They were beginning to grow. By year 2, those juveniles were reproductive adults. They were generating larvae of their own. That second generation settled on the existing reef structure and extended it further. Human hands had created the initial conditions. Nature had taken over the rest completely. The data was startling. By year 3, monitoring surveys recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shells. Nearby, soft-bottom areas with no substrate supported virtually 0. The reefs were no longer confined to the original footprint of the shell drops either. Oysters were dying naturally, contributing their own shells to the structure, providing substrate for the next wave of settlement. Vertical growth, horizontal expansion. The reef was constructing itself, and then came the moment that changed the entire public conversation around the program. Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been one of the loudest and most persistent voices opposing the shell deposition effort from the very beginning. He had testified against it before state bodies. He had warned publicly that it would destroy the fishing grounds his family had worked for 3 generations. In 2013, standing at the rail of his boat over one of the established reef sites, Lenz watched a thick school of redfish holding in the current around a shell mound. He said something he hadn't planned to say. He admitted he had been wrong. He said he had never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years on those waters. 25 years of working those exact coordinates. 25 years of declining catches and slow seasons. And now the water under his hull was thick with fish, holding to structure that hadn't existed before the program he had fought to stop. That reversal wasn't just one man changing his mind. It was the moment the scientific findings and the lived experience of the people who had fished those waters their entire lives finally lined up.
It's educating the community because they see a softer solution and they just say, how does that protect it? But once they have it put in at their neighbor's house and they say, hey, their property's not eroding, and look at the wildlife that it attracts. And that's how you get that change and you win people over.
So seeing's believing.
Seeing is believing.
If a captain who fought this program in court can change his mind on the deck of his own boat, the rest of this story is worth sticking around for. Hit subscribe before the next chapter, because what the reefs do to the water itself is harder to believe than what they did for the fishermen. You will not want to miss it. And the fish were only the beginning of what these reefs were about to do. When the fish arrived, everything changed. Reef fish don't wait for formal announcements. The instant structural complexity appears on a featureless seafloor they located. Within 2 years of the Cedar Key reefs establishing themselves, fish surveys were returning numbers that made Dr. Pine's team go back and verify their methodology from scratch. Biomass around the reef sites had increased by more than 340% compared to control areas of similar size. Species diversity was up 240%. These weren't fish that had simply relocated from somewhere else in the Gulf, drawn to a new landmark. The primary driver of the increase was juvenile fish, animals born in those waters and surviving to maturity there. The reefs weren't concentrating an existing population. They were producing life that hadn't existed in those waters before. Redfish arrived first, working the complex shell structure to feed and find cover from predators. Sheepshead followed, thriving on the invertebrate communities that had taken hold across every hard surface. Flounder worked the reef edges. Snook appeared in numbers that hadn't been documented in those waters in years. And Mike Lenz wasn't the only captain who reversed course. Charter operators across the Cedar Key area began formally requesting new reef sites near their most used fishing grounds from the exact same commission they had fought in court 6 years earlier. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants all reported measurable revenue increases tied directly to the marine activity around the reef sites.
And I've already got small oysters that have recruited to it, and there's crabs in there. And the other day I was down there and saw sheep's head pecking on it, a fish that enjoys eating barnacles and small oysters. So yes, they're already working.
The ecological cascade kept climbing the food chain. Octopuses established territories in the reef's complex gaps and overhangs. Sea turtles returned and began foraging on the invertebrate communities coating the shells. Dolphins were observed hunting systematically at reef edges, working the dense fish concentrations in coordinated passes. Every new arrival reinforced the trophic structure beneath it. The system was becoming more complex, more stable, and more biologically resilient with every passing season. What made this ecologically significant, rather than just visually impressive, was a distinction Dr. Pine's team worked carefully to establish in the published record. Artificial reefs made of concrete structures or sunken ships are historically effective at concentrating fish that already occupy an area, redistributing an existing population around a new geographic landmark. That can produce dramatic survey numbers without representing any real increase in marine life. You move fish, you don't create them. The Cedar Key reefs were doing something different. Juvenile fish counts were the primary driver of the biomass increase. The reefs were generating fish, creating survival conditions that hadn't previously existed in that ecosystem. That distinction mattered enormously for how Florida's fisheries managers thought about expanding the program. Fish were only part of what was happening. Something else was changing in the water itself, with consequences that reached far beyond the reef footprint. The billion-gallon machines. A single adult oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every day. Run that number across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving across the restored reef sites. Entire reef systems were processing billions of gallons of Gulf water daily, pulling out suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff. No machinery, no electrical infrastructure, no maintenance budget. Nature had constructed an industrial-scale water treatment operation out of discarded restaurant waste. The Gulf Coast has had a chronic nutrient pollution problem, defining its degraded condition for decades. Nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural operations and urban development pour continuously into coastal waters, fueling harmful algal blooms that cloud the water column, choke out marine life, and periodically trigger mass fish die-offs. The oyster reefs were attacking that problem at its biological root. Water clarity around the reef sites began improving measurably within a few years. Dissolved oxygen levels rose, nutrient concentrations fell. The improvements weren't staying local. They were spreading outward in a widening radius around each site. Clearer water means more sunlight reaching deeper.
You can see today, even over the reef where there is water, how clear the water is, and that's because those filtration processes are already occurring. In terms of the whole bay, it's only going to have a very small impact on the area around the reef, which is why we need to build more reefs.
Seagrass, critical habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, requires that light to survive. As the reefs cleared the water, seagrass began spreading back into zones that had been too turbid to support it for years. Then, a second feedback loop engaged. Seagrass stabilized sediment, which reduced turbidity further, which enabled more seagrass growth. Two self-reinforcing cycles, radiating improvements well beyond anything the shell drops had directly touched. Researchers eventually estimated the filtration services generated between 2007 and 2024 were worth tens of millions of dollars in ecological value. Nature was delivering it free of charge. The results didn't stay in Florida. Alabama launched its own shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana initiated large-scale reef-building initiatives. The Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor adopted the model in one of the most heavily degraded urban waterways in North America. Circular environmental design, repurposing waste materials as functional ecological infrastructure, was reshaping conservation engineering globally. Coastal engineers in Canada, Australia, and Europe began studying the Cedar Key outcomes closely. But there was one test ahead that no one had designed, one that would arrive without warning. The storm that proved everything. September 2017. Hurricane Irma, Category 4. Wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour, catastrophic storm surge. Waves with enough force to strip beaches and reshape shorelines in a matter of hours. When damage assessors moved through the area after Irma passed, they found something that stopped the conversation cold. Shorelines backed by the restored reefs had experienced dramatically less erosion, reduced by 30 to 40% compared to adjacent soft sand beaches. The dense, irregular, three-dimensional structure of the reefs had absorbed and dissipated wave energy before it reached the shore at full force. Just friction, broken momentum, protected land. Properties behind reefs still had beaches. Properties beside them, on identical coastline a few hundred yards away, had lost meters of sand and chunks of seawall. Engineers estimated the reefs prevented approximately $3 million in coastal property damage during Irma alone. The total cost of the entire 15-year program came to roughly $5 million. The reefs had nearly paid for themselves in a single storm. Seawalls crack, riprap shifts, steel corrodes, concrete eventually fails. Oyster reefs repair themselves. Storm damage triggers new larval settlement. Each generation adds height and structural complexity.
Coasts have to deal with large storms and hurricanes, but there's a growing body of research that suggests living shorelines like this one are more resilient through storms than hardened shorelines like seawalls.
The barrier was growing stronger after every storm, not weaker. Traditional shoreline armoring runs hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per mile. The Cedar Key program achieved comparable protection at a fraction of that cost, and it improved every year without additional investment. For coastal communities along the Gulf, this flipped the entire equation. Every dollar spent on a seawall was a dollar that would have to be spent again. The reefs got stronger with use, and the most extraordinary part was still unfolding. By the early 2020s, the reefs had grown substantially beyond their original footprint on their own, without any further human input. The oldest sites had roughly doubled in total area, driven entirely by the oyster reproductive cycle. Each generation settled, matured, died, and contributed shell for the next larval wave. Vertical accumulation, horizontal spread. The reef engineering its own growth on a schedule no human planner had set. Early deposits were irregular mounds of loose calcium carbonate. The living reefs that emerged were architecturally elaborate, vertical profiles, sheltered passages, overhangs, dozens of distinct microhabitats. Crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish were simultaneously exploiting different structural features within a single reef section, not sharing a substrate, inhabiting an ecosystem. Dense oyster reefs also sequester organic carbon in their shells and surrounding sediments, trapping greenhouse gases that would otherwise contribute to ocean acidification and atmospheric warming. The ecological case had quietly expanded into a climate case, almost by accident. Biodiversity metrics at the most mature Cedar Key sites were approaching levels recorded at pristine natural limestone reef systems. Endangered sea turtles had returned. Dolphins were hunting reef edges in coordinated patterns. The Gulf was rebuilding itself around the oysters, and the oysters were rebuilding themselves around the Gulf. 500,000 tons of shells tipped into the Gulf with no certainty anything would follow. Bacteria moved in within days. Oysters generations later are still extending the reef on their own. A Category 4 hurricane hit it, and the reef grew back stronger.
It's kind of a rebirth for this shell in a sense that the shell is recycled from local restaurants. It now gets used in a way that's productive for our marine habitat, but also helps build community.
So here's the question nobody at the Commission has answered yet. Does every degraded coastline on Earth need to be running this experiment right now? Or is the Gulf quietly hiding a ceiling on what oyster restoration can do? And Cedar Key just hasn't hit it yet. Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all. And the next video on your screen goes even deeper into where this restoration revolution is heading next. Click it now, because what's coming is going to surprise you.